We find ourselves in a moment of extreme uncertainty. Misinformation fueled by fake news and deepfakes threatens the foundations of our democracy. In many ways, it feels as though we're living in an episode of Black Mirror, that the future is dystopian and there's nothing we can do about it. But what if we could use visions of the future as an opportunity to inform and inspire and empower citizens? Project Immerse is a digital literacy initiative that takes the form of an immersive anthology series. Told through pervasive web-based tools, the experience drops participants into a number of playable stories designed to demystify the technology behind fake news and deepfakes.
We're here with Lance Weiler. Lance is a longtime innovator in the area of interactive storytelling. Lance, you're based in New York, right?
Yes, I'm at Columbia University in the
Okay,
city here.
excellent. And what is your title again at Columbia? You're head of a lab,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, I'm the founding director of the Columbia University School of the Arts Digital Storytelling Lab, and I'm also a professor of practice in the School of the Arts, appointed in film and theater.
Excellent. And your work on your own projects are in these areas of interactive storytelling and using new technologies for narrative, right?
Yeah, the work that we do is we explore new forms and functions of storytelling. Forms being things that are, using emergent technologies like AI, VR, AR, the Internet of Things, and functions being using storytelling for healing and learning and mobilization and entertainment.
And how did you get started in this? I mean, you've been working on it for quite a while, right?
Yeah, I started way back where I did the first all digital release of a motion picture to geosynchronous platform satellites and then downloaded onto hard drives. And that was in 1998. So that became the first all digital release of a motion picture. And that started me on a path of thinking more about ways that I could interject technology into what I was doing, and the way that I could intersect kind of code into my work in regards to just pushing at the edges of what was possible. I became more and more interested in this notion of how stories could spill off screens and into the real world and back again.
Excellent. And you've been working most recently with AI as one possible area of exploration. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been working on recently?
Sure. Well, I've been working with AI for a number of years. One of the first projects that we did that made use of artificial intelligence was a project called Frankenstein AI, which came out in 2018, celebrating the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And we felt that Frankenstein would be an interesting metaphor for artificial intelligence in the sense that, the core themes of that piece are really kind of about something, you creating something and getting out of your control, right? And so we thought it'd be interesting to kind of explore our relationship to AI. And that piece was really about this notion of how do we have more inclusive design practice around artificial intelligence, and how do we deal with bias within algorithms? And so we ended up creating this piece. It went on to go to Sundance that year in 2018, and then also went to IDFA Doc Lab. In the first form, it became an immersive theater performance piece in 3 acts, and at IDFA became an AI dinner party.
Your new piece also, Project Immerse, is how we got to cross paths because of my work with the Mozilla Festival. Project Immerse is something that you've been working on for a lot of 2020, right? I mean, how long have you been working on that project?
We started Project Immerse probably back in May.
Okay.
And Project Immerse is a really interesting, it's almost like kind of a Black Mirror anthology in a sense, but instead of being ultimately dystopian and kind of depressing like Black Mirror is, which is a wonderful program, but it definitely takes you to, it's very, it's an interesting perspective on emerging technology, we thought it'd be interesting to kind of build out an anthology series that was also kind of looked at digital literacy and also looked at apathenia, this notion of how we look for patterns in things. And through those patterns, we start to shape stories. And the underpinnings of the piece involved some research around QAnon and looking at radicalization through that lens. And it was fascinating to kind of train the AI on a variety of different data sets this time. This time, it's a paranoid thriller, deepfake thriller, I guess you could say. So we trained it on 70s paranoid thrillers. We trained it on WikiLeaks, a number of other available data sets that we would find that were thematically aligned with what we wanted to explore. And what it does is we use web pervasive technology. So we built an experience that you go through in terms of within Zoom and Miro, which is a whiteboarding platform, which allows you to collaborate with others. So you'll be in breakout rooms with different people, and you'll be navigating kind of this canvas that's full of about 90% of the items that you come across, the collages per se that are in it, are made with AI. So it's deep fake video, audio, text, music, so you're interacting with these things and you're trying to figure out what happened. And the narrative of the piece is about a teenager who buys a body cam off the internet and then realizes that there's still compromising footage on it and somebody or something comes for it, right? And so that's like the pilot episode. And so folks realize there's a high school student, they find themselves in a quarantine classroom interacting with other students, which are actually, everything that you're interacting with for the most part is kind of deep fake in it. So you're interacting with bots, and then you find yourself in Zoom breakout rooms, sometimes with real people, other times deep fakes or shallow fakes. And so it becomes this amazing kind of thing where you start to question what reality is. And you start to try to shape with those other people kind of a theory of what you think was on the body cam, what you think happened to this teenager. And so that's a project that we're doing in conjunction with the Columbia University School of the Arts Digital Storytelling Lab, with SIPA, which is the School of International Public Affairs, and also Teachers College, and the Brown Institute for Media Innovation.
Excellent. What I wanted to ask next was how you see this developing, because you mentioned Zoom and Miro as being sort of common tools that you're using, in addition to really sophisticated things like training your own AI on various corpuses. But how do you see this developing? Where's it going?
Well, I think there's a couple interesting things to look at. I think one is you find AI kind of intersecting with the arts in interesting ways. So I think in one sense, it's augmenting creative process. And that could be anywhere in your workflow, from pre-visualization to automating different things that are happening when you're actually on set, in terms of shooting, but then also in the post-production process. What's interesting in terms of the way that we're using it is we're actually writing with AI. So it's almost like a William S. Burroughs cut-up exercise where we see what the machine spits out, we look at it, we prune that data set, and then we push it back in, put it back in, let it bake for a bit, have it spit something out and look at it and say, okay, well, that makes sense or that doesn't, and we just have an iterative process. It's changed the way that I'm thinking about the construction of narrative. It's much more nonlinear in the case of what we're doing with Project Immerse, but it raises interesting questions in terms of how I'm thinking about productions and what I do, because I work in film and television as well, thinking about ways that I can weave artificial intelligence into that workflow that I have when I'm thinking about writing, all the way through to when I'm releasing something. And then I also think there's interesting things that are happening within Project Immerse in particular, where there's a certain thing when folks are coming in and we're using web pervasive technologies at this particular instance, but in a certain regard, eventually we could create what's known as a state machine. So people could come in and it could automate the whole process. So when people were in a certain part of the site, it recognized that there was a concentration of people there, and it
Mhm.
released something. It released video, it released audio, it changed colors, it faded to black. That we could look at the system clock and determine how long it had been progressing, and then trigger certain things at different times. We could also pull metadata from what people were entering into the experience and bring that back and weave it into the storytelling. So I think that there's a lot of interesting opportunities with the way in which harnessing artificial intelligence can enrich what you're making. I think it's early days in it, but I think that that's exciting because I don't think that there's necessarily fully a grammar for it yet. But I do really believe that some of the great works of the 21st century will come from forms that embrace these emergent technologies, not only in the dissemination of the work, but also in the way we're thinking about and challenging ourselves to create it and actually to produce it.
Excellent. Last question for you. We've got a group assembled here for that are coming from national broadcasters of the European Union and elsewhere in the European Broadcast Union. And what would your advice be for them as they start to really adapt different workflows relating to AI? How would you suggest that they go about it?
Well, I think what's interesting is just through experimentation and dabbling with it. There are so many. One of the reasons with Project Immerse why we wanted to make it was there's so many new tools that are available that are easily accessible, which in the case of deepfakes creates challenges, right? It means that it's very easy to create a deepfake. Like I could make one in a matter of minutes with us here,
Mhm.
off my mobile phone, right? There's apps that allow you to make deepfakes. The moment that there was a face swapping app, Pandora was out of the box per se, right?
Mhm.
So, in the sense of thinking about it, I think just experimenting with it. And there's ways to do it without even having to code. Runway ML is a tool, for instance, that you can use. It's used for artists who want to manipulate images and video and a whole bunch of other text using GPT 2 and soon 3
Mhm.
within that core application. But I think for anybody that wants to experiment with it, the key is experimenting with it, right? The other thing to note is, those formerly known as the audience. I think there's a major shift that's happening where a whole new generation is coming up, very familiar with the fluidity of screens and how they interface with them and how they actually make things too.
Mhm.
So this idea that those formerly known as the audience are actually becoming collaborators and storytellers is something that I think, I constantly keep in mind when I'm making work, right? I think it's important to consider, it's a factor that I consider, right? I consider what does that mean to where there's whole generations that it's very much it's either lean in or lean back, but with some of the new generations it's so in between that all the time, and it's fluctuating between a variety of different screens. It's challenging. So I wonder how AI will be part of that process, not only in the potential creation of the work, but also in the personalization of work too, in the way in which it can be delivered, and how is that kind of combined with the term of like the metaverse, this
Yeah.
idea that like everything will start to become more fluid in terms of like how we interact with media, how we interact with screens. So
Mhm.
whether that's through a VR headset, or whether that's through augmented reality and we're out in the world, or it's through a gaming engine in some way, I think you can look at early tests with it. Like No Man's Sky was an interesting example, a
Definitely.
generative world that was constantly being generated. And people complained because they were like, I never saw anybody. I was out in space and I was, exploring. But, like when I put my flag on the planet, I don't know if anybody will ever see it, and I never saw anyone else. So it's probably very realistic. The
Mhm.
initial release was very realistic to what probably space travel is like. But people wanted connection. So I think what's interesting about what you'll see with AI is accelerating the way in which we're discovering. There's already a lot of work within that in terms of algorithms and augmenting the discovery process. I would argue that a lot of the large technology companies are in fact AI companies. I would say Facebook, Apple, Google, so forth and so on. So I think for broadcasters, just trying to, kind of wrap your heads around it, dabble in it, spend a little time kind of thinking about how could it enter your workflow and what might that mean. I think sometimes, like I'll give presentations and I'll say, okay, I'll have a box on the screen, right? And then I'll have a little dot that's all the way over on the other side of the screen. And I'll point to the dot and I'll say, we're going to be over here. Right. So a lot of what I'm kind of talking about to the general audience might seem like it's kind of ahead or it might seem foreign. But, Marshall McLuhan famously said that we kind of march into the future and we shape our business models through the rear view mirror. Right. And so I think the more that we can actually dabble and experiment with the technology and be open to how we use it means that we'll be in a better position moving forward. And that creates not only an opportunity for improving the work that we make, but it also, ultimately gives a competitive edge to what you're doing in terms of the programming that you're making. So.
Fantastic. Lance Weiler, thank you so much for spending some time with us here. Very much looking forward to seeing the premiere of Project Immerse at the Mozilla Festival. Thanks again.
Thank you, Doug. Nice to be here.